Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Hello and welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Galveston has had its fair share of sicknesses and pandemics over the past 200 years, including yellow fever, Spanish flu, cholera, measles, dengue fever, and smallpox. But did you know, in 1920, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague here on the island? In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Paula Summerly. She has studied the bubonic plague outbreak and associated events over the past few years. We discussed the bubonic plague outbreak, some of the people involved, what the city and authorities did about it, as well as events going on around the island at that time. We also touch a lot on the University of Texas medical branch and the early days of medical education in Texas. We also talk a lot about the Ashbel Smith Building, also known as Old Red. Old Red was designed by famous Galveston architect Nicholas Clayton, and if you've spent more than a few hours on Galveston Island, I guarantee you've seen some of Nicholas Clayton's work, and the Ashbel Smith Building is one of his most notable. Without further ado, let's jump right into my conversation with Dr. Paula Summerly. Dr. Paula Summerly, how did you end up in Galveston, Texas?
It's a long story, but I came to Galveston in 2012 for a 6-month scholarship in the Institute for the Medical Humanities at the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston, shortened to UTMB. And when I arrived, I really wanted to do some research on Galveston doctors, focusing on visual sources in the Moody Medical Library, hopefully photographs, because I did my doctorate in the history of clinical photography. And to my chagrin, they didn't have any photographs. And so I thought, what am I going to do? I've got this scholarship. So I went to the medical library and they told me they had drawings. And I'm like, drawings aren't quite the same as photographs. But I started to research the drawings and who created the drawings, and it turned out it was an anatomist from Edinburgh, which is 60 miles up the road, because I'm from Wallsend, and the northeast of England, and found a collection of drawings by an Edinburgh anatomist who came to Galveston in 1891, lots of large-scale drawings. He used chalk and all kinds of media to do these anatomical diagrams, which he called wall diagrams. And I found photographs of Dr. Keeler using these drawings in his class. And I started to spar intellectually with Keeler, who died in 1931. His house was about second west of the original Mexican cafe. There's a historical marker outside his house. He died there in 1931. I've been told I research people like I'm writing a novel. So we started to spar because he's Scottish and I'm English, so we kind of don't get on. He wrote an article saying he loathed photography. I love photography. And so I started to embattle researching this man and his drawings. And he kind of incensed me. I think that's what a driving force. But I ended up curating an exhibit of some of Dr. Keeler's drawing called Abstract Anatomy, and I focused in on certain particular details from his drawings and reproduced them in an exhibit, which appeared in the Galveston Daily News supplement several years ago. And it turned out Keeler was also the curator of the first anatomical museum at UTMB. And after I finished my scholarship, I was on the last day, I was invited to come back to work with some of the anatomical and pathological collections that UTMB has. So I went back to the UK briefly, and then I came back to do an inventory of the historical collections. And that was 9 years ago.
And you're still doing the inventory.
Well, it's like painting a bridge. You get to one end, and then it's time to start again.
Yes.
But those collections, some of them will form the basis of a new medical museum in Dr. Keeler's former lab on the top floor of Old Red.
Yeah.
And we've actually utilized the top floor of Old Red, which in the 1900s was described as the finest dissecting hall in America. It's designed on the concept of an artist studio, abundant natural light so you could dissect. It's a beautiful space. One of the few spaces in Old Red or the Ashbel Smith Building that hasn't been changed too much. And we've got vivid descriptions of what the floor surfaces were like, the shelving, beautiful photographs, so you could reconstruct the lab as it was in the early days. But that will hopefully be used to house a new medical museum in the near future.
I'm really excited about that. That would be a fascinating museum to go check out.
Indeed. It's a labor of love, I have to say. And it's allowed me to learn about, the lives of people. And when I first saw Old Red, I thought, what is that doing there? You need to look at the really early photographs when it was almost standalone. The old John Seeley Hospital is just east of Old Red on the Strand. And that was also designed by Nicholas Clayton, who also designed Old Red, sort of Romanesque revival-style architecture. It's beautiful, still a mirage to me in many ways. So the early days of the medical school is something that really fascinates me, from 1891 to around 1901, and then I peel off.
Yeah.
Being a Victorian.
Yeah. So the early days, it was established in the 1891?
1891, 5th of October was the day classes started. But I must mention that the School of Nursing started in 1890, and that was next door.
Oh, nice.
So the nurses have a longer history than the John Seeley School of Medicine has just been renamed.
What are some of the things that draw you to those early days?
Well, the building itself is enigmatic, and I'm really interested in the early days. The first faculty, particularly the surgeon and the pathologist, Alan J. Smith, James Edwin Thompson was the first professor of surgery. He came from the UK in 1891. And 3 of these gentlemen were the first curators of museums. So we do have what I call a museological history. And there was an advert in the British Medical Journal in 1891 inviting people to apply for positions at this new medical school. And they promised the building was fitted with the most modern equipment. When you go through the papers of Dr. Alan John Smith, Dr. James Edwin Thompson, Dr. William Keeler, there was nothing. And so they started the medical school from scratch. I've managed to trace in a miscellaneous ledger details of all the equipment that they were buying. The books, I've tried to trace some of the books in the first library, the laboratory equipment, pathology, anatomy, jars that they were buying for specimens, everything. You could reconstruct the whole medical school from scratch, which is something I'd like to do digitally, but
yes,
I might need to get your advice on that.
That should be a project we jump in on. That'd be great.
Yeah, fly through the building from the early days. You could have a time slot. And then after 1901, you'd have to take over because I've ended up being the unofficial docent for UTMB. I started doing tours of the building. I've never advertised them, and they became so popular. My boss said, Paula, you just have to learn to say no. And I'm really focused on the early days. So I go floor by floor from the basement and explain what was where in the early days, and that the entire medical school was housed in that one building.
I can't even imagine that, because the building is large, but when you compare it to everything around it now, well over 100 years of expansion, it's insane to think, everything took place, most of it took place right in that building.
Well, that's a great observation. So in the early days, there were around 12 or 13 faculty and about the same number of students. Mm-hmm. In the School of Medicine when they first started. Mm-hmm. By 1925, vast expansion, faculty and students. So if you look across from Old Red, just south, is what was called the new laboratory building, which is now known as the Keeler Building, named after William Keeler, the first professor of anatomy. So that housed a lot of the teaching activities from 1925 because Old Red couldn't cope with the vast increase in numbers.
Why did they choose Galveston?
It was put to a public vote, and there were several options, including Houston. But Galveston won hands down, so the people in the county voted for it.
Oh, wow. I guess I never really thought of it from that perspective in the late 1880s, 1890s when you're thinking about this. So they're like, oh, let's put this in a hurricane-prone area and slap it right in here.
Well, part of the answer comes from the heyday. Galveston has numerous firsts. UTMB wasn't the first medical school. There were precursors. There was a Galveston Medical College, which was in a house owned by Dr. Greensville Dowell in the 1860s. And then there was the Texas Medical College, which was a few blocks down from Old Red. And the Texas Medical College closed to make way for university in 1891.
So one reason I wanted to have you in today is because I know you've done extensive research into the bubonic plague in Galveston. Yes. So how did you get into the bubonic plague?
Metaphorically.
Yes.
So when I first came to UTMB, my job was to make an inventory. And I started with the anatomical collection, which is in Old Red, and then I moved on to the pathology collection. And the pathology collection actually contains the remnants of two museums, the Pathological Museum from 1891 and a Surgical Pathology Museum, which was started in 1914. So there's a kind of mixture of two collections there. And I should have said that the museums across anatomy pathology started in 1891, and the three museums by the 1950s, 1960s had closed. And that follows a pattern in Europe and elsewhere in North America that a lot of medical museums were dismantled, changes in the curriculum, introduction of imaging. It's a standard pattern. The rise and the fall of museums fits into a known pattern. So anyway, when I came to Galveston, initially my job was to make an inventory. So I was working through the pathological collection, and I should mention that some of the star specimens that I found were from 1897, and they survived the 1900 storm, obviously. And Old Red lost its ornamental roof during the 1900 storm. And to have a specimen there from 1897, and when I give tours of the building, I always say there's a couple of specimens I'd like to interview, one of which would be a brain from 1897. What a story. And Alan J. Smith, the first professor of pathology, entered Old Red just after the 1900 storm and said, don't worry about the specimens, they were in a side room, and they're still in a side room to the present day. But anyway, that's another story. So the pathology collection has the remnants of diseased organs removed during autopsy or surgical diseased tissues, etc. And I found just a tiny little innocuous jar, and it had a label on it, bubonic plague. So I was totally thrilled and enamored, and I thought there might be more, but there wasn't. It wasn't particularly spectacular to look at. It's what I describe in lay terms as a femoral bubo. It's essentially a slice through a swollen lymph gland, but it had a number etched on the jar. And I knew that that number may correspond with an autopsy protocol or report. So that gave me a date, which was the summer of 1920. And I got a brief description, a 17-year-old man, no name, and his cause of death, which was bubonic plague. That wasn't enough for me, of course.
You have to dive into that.
Yes, I know. A frustrated detective here. So I knew the Moody Medical Library had amongst their historical collections a bubonic plague notebook. And I thought, I'm going to cross-reference some of the data and the descriptions with an entry in the notebook. And lo and behold, I find the details of a young 17-year-old man who was working in a grain store on 29th and Strand Street in the summer of 1920, and he was bitten by an infected flea and started to get a fever and went home. He actually lived on 16th and Mechanic, and
close to where I live.
2 days later he ended up in the John Seeley Hospital and passed. So during the autopsy, they took various samples, microscope slides, and diagnosed bubonic plague. And the young man was buried in Lakeview Cemetery, 10 p.m. in the evening. So 5 hours after the autopsy, he was buried at night. And I thought to myself, why? And it was obvious. They were frightened. And then the next day, there's an article in the Galveston Daily News, what may be bubonic plague is here. There was a longshoreman strike around Harbourside, and along the seawall there were bathing beauty pageants. And when you go to the newspapers, you don't really get a sense of the enormous social unrest that took part on the island. And come to Galveston, playground of the South, bathing beauty pageants along the seawall, bubonic plague around the Strand, and then longshoreman strike.
Wow, so there's quite a bit going on in Galveston at that time. How exactly is the bubonic plague transmitted?
The fleas carry the bacteria by in the rat, and so they bite the rat. So the bacteria is in the blood, and once the rat dies, the fleas are looking for another host to jump onto, so a human being. And you may know, I do through experience, fleas like jumping up and getting around your ankles, and that's where this young man's bite was. So, and given he worked in a grain store, I think they looked for dead rats and found some. So they put all the data together. After this young man died, one of his co-workers started having symptoms. So then it started to spread. So it can spread through sort of droplet inhalation is one way. Through, if you cough, and then that'd be pneumonic plague. So after the first death, there were treatments available, a kind of vaccine. And so over several weeks, more people, and they did kind of cluster maps of where the people were living and what their occupations were to try and see what any connections. It's almost like a forensic, points of contact to see what was going on. And overall, over several months, there were 18 cases of bubonic plague, 12 deaths. The age group from 3 to people in their 70s. Occupation, there was a watchman, a driver, a longshoreman, a steward on one of the ships, and most famously, a pathologist at UTMB.
Ooh.
So what happened? Dr. Anna Bowie, I'd say with my English accent, Dr. Anna Bowie had just graduated from the UTMB School of Medicine in 1920. So she's a young graduate. She became an assistant in the pathology lab, helping with autopsies, etc. When she was finishing an autopsy on one of the plague victims, she accidentally pricked her finger, and she knew it instantly, so she tried to wash her finger. She then cauterized the wound and hoped that would be enough, but unfortunately it wasn't. So Anna, after trying to she cauterized the wound, and unfortunately, she knew that she was showing symptoms, which would be like a fever, and then the lymph glands in your body, so around your neck area, under your armpits and your groin, started to swell. So she took the first drug that was available, which is anti-plague serum, as it was called, and she self-injected. And then Hafkeen's vaccine, a vaccine became available. So she decided to inject herself with that. So she had like a double dose. And she was off work from the pathology lab for 2 months. And then she was back. And the first autopsy she did was on another plague victim.
Oh, no.
Yes, but she was careful this time.
Oh, my gosh.
Needle stick injuries, as they're called, aren't unheard of. I mean, they're best to be avoided. She was wearing gloves at the time, but and there are protocols in place on what to do if you accidentally prick your finger. So she
survived?
She did.
Okay.
And I thought, what an amazing woman. And I thought, I want to know more about Anna. And so I started using different manuscripts and archives, newspaper searches for her. And after 1924, I couldn't find her. Nothing. And I thought maybe she married, changed her name, maybe she died. I had no idea. At a last-ditch attempt, I knew she was a member of one of the medical societies. And the medical library here have the index cards of all the members, and we're talking about 1920. So I went through those and I found Anna's membership card, and it had an address in Nashville, Tennessee. So I thought, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. So I started randomly Googling Dr. Anna Bowie, Nashville, Tennessee. 3 internet clicks later, I found the Bowie Nature Park in Fairview, Tennessee, and there's photographs of Anna.
Oh, wow.
As part of the history of the park. And it turns out Anna and her siblings saved all their money and bought land in Fairview, Tennessee, which is now known as the Bowie Nature Park. So I contacted the friends of the Bowie Nature Park and introduced myself, and they told me they had Anna's archive because we have nothing here about her. So I went to meet the friends, and they showed me photographs of Anna standing on the steps of Old Red, and the Tennessean newspaper wrote a piece about my visit to the archive. So when I do exhibits for Women's History Month, Anna is always part of it. She died in 1980, aged 90.
Man. Oh, wow.
And she only ever mentioned having bubonic plague once. And the friends of the Bowie Nature Park wanted to know if she actually had bubonic plague, and I said she did.
Yeah, you would be the authority to say, oh, yes, she did, and here's how she got over it.
But stiff upper lip, not mention it, maybe once.
Yeah. No big deal. I got over bubonic plague. Oh, my God. So at the time, in 1920, was the general consensus, did they know it was coming from rats and fleas? Did, I guess, the authorities know that this is a problem that's kind of stemming from the port? Or where did they lay the blame? Fleas, rats, port?
Great question. One conundrum that we still haven't worked out is, where did the plague come from? The first outbreak began in China in 1894, and the plague carried westward. And by 1900, it made it via ships to San Francisco. And then we think, but we don't know, that it came south. And at the time the outbreak happened in Galveston, there were other ports, Port Arthur, Florida, and Beaumont. They also had outbreaks of bubonic plague as well. So shipping is one possibility.
Okay, so there was a bubonic plague outbreak here in 1920. What were some of the things that the authorities did about the bubonic plague to try to prevent this? Did people wear masks? Did they all know it was the fleas and rats?
No masking, but a community, response. So people were encouraged to trap and kill rats. And another little conundrum was a plague laboratory was set up on 21st and Mechanic, and Dr. Mark Boyd was part of the U.S. Public Health Service response team. So the local community were encouraged to trap rats, put a label on them, and drop them off at the plague laboratory for analysis. And Dr. Boyd and his team were actually looking for rats that showed signs of having bubonic plague, swollen lymph glands, etc. So that went on for several months, and they investigated around 46,000 rats over several months. That's a lot of rats.
That is too many rats.
Yes.
Oh.
So part of the response to bubonic plague, as well as vaccines for those who were infected, catching rats, the city employed rat trappers, fumigation of buildings, and any ships coming in and out were also fumigated. There was no actual quarantine as such. They managed to avoid that. It was a real communal effort. I think the Boy Scouts were involved. They hung up posters encouraging people not to leave trash, and the city got involved in clearing back alleys and pull down unoccupied buildings, and that kind of thing happened. One of the lasting pieces of evidence of bubonic plague in Galveston involved rat-proofing of corner stores. It became an ordinance that corner stores had to have reinforced structures, and some of those structures actually survive in what were former corner stores to the present day. So that answers an architectural conundrum.
How would they rat-proof?
It's just almost reinforced kind of concrete structures, so the rats couldn't get in and go dig upwards into the store itself.
Okay, I got it. They would have to find another way in, just not from the ground.
Yes, yes.
Are there any photos of this?
One of the homeowners who has renovated a corner store actually shared photographs. So I have actually seen that they don't look very dramatic, but I know that several other corner stores have been renovated and no one was quite sure why these structures were there. And now it's all to do with bubonic plague.
I'm going to try to find some photos and apply them to this episode.
Well, bubonic plague isn't something sort of resigned to history. There are between 1 and 17 cases per year in the United States, but it's treated with antibiotics, so you don't need to worry.
Oh, okay. So at least we have antibiotics to keep us away from that. But I guess there's always the possibility that there is an outbreak of bubonic plague on Galveston Island again.
If you get too close to some dead rodents and the fleas jump on you, maybe.
I'll stay away. I'll stay away from that. What are some other kind of interesting facts that you've found while digging through all these bubonic plague facts that you're just digging through all the time?
I think one of the most surprising thing is how you can do kind of contextual research, how one clue connects to another, going from a specimen to rat proofing to a graveyard to newspaper articles. That's what really kind of interests me. I call kind of contextual research. So I've really encouraged students to think about the lives of people and how they dealt with various tragedies, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of things that really interest me. I try to focus on women's history, given I was really interested in Dr. Anna Bowie's story. So I start looking at some of the early graduates from the medical school and following their lives. That's something I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in the history of pathology. I'd probably describe myself as either a frustrated detective or a frustrated pathologist, or bits of both, depending on the day. So I kind of lilt between those kind of subjects. But my main interests are people and their lives and what happened to them and following their story.
Could you tell us a little bit about women graduates from the medical school?
Sure. So Anna graduated in 1920 with a medical degree, and she came to Galveston because her home university, which would have been Vanderbilt, didn't allow women to study medicine until the 1920s. And what's really fascinating is that the first woman to graduate from UTMB School of Medicine was Marie Delalondre Dietzel in 1897, which is spectacular. So I'm very proud and impressed by that.
Have you done any research into any other women who made an impact in the medical community in Galveston?
There were other women. Marie Charlotte Schaefer is somebody that really interests me. She was the first woman on the medical school faculty. She graduated from the medical school in 1901, and by 1925 she was the first woman on the faculty of the School of Medicine, and she taught embryology and histology. And we're lucky enough to have some of her original drawings from her laboratory sessions. She died in 1927. There are lots of other women that I'd really like to research, kind of pioneers, and also the School of Nursing as well. So there's just endless pioneering women, as I call them. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, UTMB had museums of anatomy, pathology, and surgical pathology. And that's not really commonly known, that Old Red actually had museums, and unusually for the state of Texas, they were open to the general public. Now times have changed, so I'm sure there'll be some changes that will be required for a future museum, but it's kind of really interesting to think about museological history. And those collections helped the university develop an international reputation for excellence in practical medical education. So in the early 1900s, students did drawing classes, how to learn about the structure of the human body through dissection, but also drawing those structures to help get that information into your brain for recall. And in the early days, students studied anatomy 3 hours per day, 5 days per week. Today's medical students, 8 weeks, and they're done with anatomy. So the collections that we have are the remnants of former curricula, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so working with those collections in a sort of ethical and respectful manner is really important, that they're not just antiquities that sit on a shelf. They have purpose for medical students to brush up on their anatomy and that kind of thing.
Are there any aspects of Galveston history that particularly stick out to you that you really like and maybe want to dive into and learn more about?
Well, obviously, Galveston is synonymous with the 1900 storm. And what I've learned about Old Red is there are kind of factual histories of Old Red, and then they're kind of mythical or partly factual stories about Old Red. You know, people apparently hid in Old Red during the 1900 storm, but I can't find the evidence of that. It doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen. So I'm really interested in the history of the building and the lives and who was running in and out of that building and what was going on in the early days. I'd like to do a kind of knocking on wall during the evening to find out where the real walls and where the artificial ones, and reconstruct each room, because half the building is now taken over by an air handling system, but it wasn't like that in the early days.
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine being in there dissecting all kinds of things, and there's no AC, it's just open air.
Well, the anatomists prided themselves on having a kind of healthy dissecting room, for want of a better description, and the high ceilings on the third floor would, the fumes would travel upwards, yes, and the place was kept in good condition. So, I just can't imagine. And dissecting with your suit and bow tie on as well.
Oh my God.
And your apron.
I've never had any other podcast where I'm just like shivering, like, oh my God, I can't even. Rats and fleas and dissections and the swollen thyroids. Well, is there anything else you would like to discuss or get out there or talk about?
Well, we're hoping to host events, given things change with the pandemic, to make the tours of the building, but all of it has to be pre-planned. There is a Old Red Medical Museum website, so if you want to get up to date. As I speak, there's an art and anatomy exhibit being installed by Joan Finn, who is an art teacher, an artist in her own right. And the images created by school children and teachers around the state. So we'll be making that open to the public in a sort of staggered way, if that makes sense. I definitely, one of these days, I want to sit down with you again, and maybe we could talk about some other plagues and sicknesses and fevers and whatnot. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and perhaps we can go on a tour of Old Red in the early days. I think that would be a real treat. I think that'd be great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening in on the conversation with Dr. Paula Summerly. If you learned anything or enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. A rating, a review, a subscription, it means so much. And if you would like more Galveston content, please follow us on social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. We're pretty much everywhere. And finally, if there's any topic, history, story you want to hear or you want to tell on this podcast, just check out our website. You can find it in the description below, and click that Submit History tab. Fill out the little form and we will be in touch. Again, thank you so much for listening and supporting. Galveston Unscripted would not be here without you, the listener. We'll see you next time on Galveston Unscripted. For historic resources or more information, check out the episode description.